It's the summer of 946 AD, and across the endless forests of Eastern Europe, the sky has turned blood red. Not from a sunset, but from the glow of 1,000 fires consuming human flesh. 5,000 men are burning alive simultaneously, their screams echoing for miles through the trees. And standing at the center of this unprecedented carnage, watching every moment of agony with ice-cold satisfaction, is a 40-year-old woman whose blue eyes reflect the flames like windows into hell itself. This woman is Olga of Kiev, and what you are about to hear is a story so brutal, so calculated, and so shocking that it reads like something out of a horror movie. But here's the thing, this isn't fiction. This actually happened. And the woman who orchestrated these atrocities? She was later made a saint by the Christian Church? You might be wondering, how does a medieval princess in an age when women had almost no power manage to orchestrate such elaborate and brutal revenge that it terrorized all of Eastern Europe? How could someone who would later be canonized as a saint commit atrocities that would shame the most bloodthirsty tyrants in history? Let me tell you something. The history books don't tell you the full story of Olga of Kiev. They'll mention she was a ruler, sure. They'll tell you she converted to Christianity. But they won't tell you about the calculated genius behind some of the most creative acts of revenge in human history. They won't tell you how she transformed from a loving wife into a master manipulator who could smile at her enemies while planning their deaths in excruciating detail. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey through one of the most fascinating and terrifying stories in medieval history. We'll explore how a woman who started as a devoted wife became one of the most feared rulers of her time. You'll learn about her brilliant political mind, her ruthless methods, and how she managed to completely annihilate an entire people while consolidating power in a male-dominated world. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Olga of Kiev represents one of the most complex figures in history, a woman who embodied both the heights of political genius and the depths of human cruelty. You'll see how her story reveals uncomfortable truths about power, revenge, and what happens when someone with exceptional intelligence decides that mercy is weakness. This is the story of Saint Olga of Kiev, devoted wife, brilliant ruler, converted Christian, and one of history's most creative killers. And trust me, this story will change how you think about medieval history forever. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into a tale of love, betrayal, and a thirst for revenge that could only be quenched by the complete extermination of an entire people. This is the brutal vengeance of Olga of Kiev. Let me start by painting you a picture of the world Olga was born into, because understanding her background is crucial to understanding how she became the woman who could order the deaths of thousands without blinking an eye. It's the year 890 AD, and we're in the wild borderlands between what we now call Russia and Estonia. This isn't the civilized medieval Europe you might imagine from movies. This is a harsh, unforgiving landscape of endless forests, freezing winters, and scattered settlements where survival depends on strength, cunning, and the ability to make alliances that keep you alive. The region is part of something called Kievan Rus, which is emerging as a major power through the unification of Slavic tribes under Viking leaders who had descended from Scandinavia down the Russian rivers. Think of it as a melting pot of cultures. Slavic natives mixing with Norse warriors, creating something entirely new and formidable. Into this world, Olga is born in a small village near Pskov. Now here's what makes her story immediately interesting. Even as a child, she stood out. We're talking about a time when most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, where women had almost no rights, and where being noticed usually meant trouble. But Olga? She was different. The chronicles from that time, and remember, writing down someone's story was rare and expensive, describe her as having exceptional beauty, but more importantly, they mention her sharp intelligence. In a world where most women were valued only for their ability to produce male heirs, Olga was known for her mind. That's incredibly unusual for the time period. Picture a teenage girl who could think 3 moves ahead in political situations, who could read people's intentions just by watching their body language, and who had the kind of presence that made grown men take notice. That was Olga. She wasn't just surviving in this harsh world, she was thriving. And here's where her story takes its first dramatic turn. When she's about 15 years old, still practically a child by our standards, but considered marriage age in medieval times, she catches the attention of someone who would change the course of her entire life, Igor, son of Rurik and heir to the throne of Kiev. Now, let me tell you how they met, because it's like something out of a fairy tale, except this fairy tale ends with thousands of people burning alive. Igor is out hunting in the forests near Pskov when he encounters this young woman crossing a river in a small boat, alone. Think about that for a moment. A teenage girl navigating dangerous waters by herself in a region known for bandits, wild animals, and tribal conflicts. According to the chronicles, Igor wasn't just fascinated by her appearance. What caught his attention was her courage. Here was a girl who wasn't afraid to travel alone through territory that seasoned warriors approached with caution. She had confidence, competence, and absolutely no fear. For a future king who would need to trust his partner with his life and his kingdom, those qualities were worth more than all the gold in Constantinople. The marriage that followed in 919 AD wasn't just a union between 2 people. It was a political earthquake that united 2 of the most powerful lineages in the region. But here's what makes their relationship extraordinary. In an age when royal marriages were pure political arrangements where the couple might meet for the first time at their wedding, Igor and Olga developed something genuine. For the next 25 years, they ruled Kiev together in what became legendary as one of the most effective partnerships in medieval history. And I want you to really understand what this meant, because it sets up everything that comes after. Igor was a brilliant military commander who expanded their territory through strategic campaigns. He was the warrior king, the one who led from the front and made their enemies fear the very name of Kiev. But Olga? Olga was the political genius who made their conquests stick. While Igor was out winning battles, Olga was back home creating the systems that turned military victories into lasting power. She established legal codes that protected merchants and encouraged trade. She organized tribute systems that funded their military expansion without crushing their subjects. She negotiated alliances that secured their western borders, while Igor conquered eastern territories. In other words, Igor conquered with the sword, but Olga conquered with her mind. Think about what this means in the context of medieval Europe. We're talking about a time when most women couldn't own property, couldn't make legal decisions, and were basically considered slightly more valuable than livestock. But Olga was actively governing one of the most powerful kingdoms in Eastern Europe. She was writing laws, commanding armies, and negotiating with foreign powers as an equal. The couple had a son, Sviatoslav, in 942 AD, ensuring the dynasty would continue. But according to every historical source we have, what really made their partnership special was their personal relationship. Byzantine ambassadors, sophisticated cosmopolitan visitors from the most advanced empire of their time, wrote about how unusual it was to see rulers who genuinely cared for each other. In their letters back to Constantinople, these ambassadors described the exceptional devotion that Kiev's rulers showed to each other. They noted how Igor would consult Olga on major decisions, how she would publicly support his military campaigns, and how their personal harmony created political stability throughout their kingdom. In a world where royal couples were often bitter enemies forced to cooperate, Igor and Olga were a team. But here's the thing about happiness in medieval times. It was fragile. and it could be destroyed in an instant by politics, war, or simple miscalculation. And in the year 945 AD, Igor made a decision that would shatter not only his own life, but transform his devoted wife into one of history's most terrifying rulers. The decision seemed logical at the time. Kiev needed money to fund campaigns against the Byzantines, and the Drevlians, a Slavic tribe living in the dense forests south of Kiev, owed tribute. They had been conquered before, forced to pay after brutal military campaigns. But Igor decided their payments weren't enough. He wanted more, much more. What Igor didn't realize was that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would end with his torture and death, and transform his loving wife into a woman capable of orchestrating some of the most creative acts of mass murder in human history. Now, we come to the moment that changed everything, not just for Olga, but for the entire history of Eastern Europe, and I want you to pay close attention to the details here, because understanding exactly what happened to Igor is crucial to understanding why Olga's revenge was so calculated and so brutal. It's autumn 945 AD. Igor has been ruling Kiev for over 25 years, and he's facing a problem that every medieval ruler knew well. He needs money. His campaigns against the Byzantine Empire have been expensive. His army needs supplies, and maintaining control over his vast territory requires constant financial resources. So he turns his attention to the Drevlians. Now, let me tell you about the Drevlians, because these aren't just random victims in our story. These are a Slavic tribe known throughout the region for two things: their skill in warfare and their absolute hatred of being controlled by anyone else. They lived in the dense forests south of Kiev, and they had been forced to pay tribute to Igor after brutal military campaigns in previous years. But they paid reluctantly, resentfully, and always while planning their next opportunity for rebellion. Igor's decision to dramatically increase their tribute payments wasn't just about money, it was about demonstrating power. He wanted to show the Drevlians and every other tribe in his territory that resistance was futile. What he didn't realize was that he was about to make one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in medieval history. Here's where Igor's confidence became his fatal flaw. Instead of sending a large army to collect the increased tribute, he decided to go personally with only 200 warriors. Think about that decision for a moment. Igor was essentially walking into hostile territory, surrounded by people who hated him, with a force that was vastly outnumbered by the local population. Why would he do something so obviously dangerous? The answer reveals something important about medieval psychology. Igor genuinely believed, that his military reputation alone would be enough to intimidate the Drevlians into compliance. He had spent decades building a fearsome reputation as a warrior who couldn't be defeated. In his mind, the Drevlians wouldn't dare attack him because they knew the consequences would be swift and brutal. He was about to learn that reputation without adequate military backing is just an illusion waiting to be shattered. When Igor arrived at Iskorostan, the main Drevlian city, with his small escort, the tribal leaders initially played along. They welcomed him with proper ceremony, they paid the increased tribute without visible protest, and they sent him on his way with all the honors due to their overlord. Igor must have felt vindicated. His strategy had worked. His reputation was intact. But the Drevlians were thinking several moves ahead, just like chess players setting up a devastating combination. They let Igor collect his tribute and begin his journey home because they wanted him away from their main city, away from any potential witnesses, and in terrain where their superior numbers would be decisive. The ambush came in a dense forest where Igor's cavalry couldn't maneuver effectively, and where 200 men would be completely overwhelmed by 2,000 Drevlian warriors who knew every tree, every path, and every hiding spot. It wasn't really a battle, it was a slaughter. Igor's men, surprised and hopelessly outnumbered, were cut down in minutes. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals the true depths of Drevlian hatred for their Kiev overlords. They didn't just kill Igor in the heat of battle. They captured him alive, and what they did next was designed to send a message that would echo throughout Eastern Europe. The execution method they chose was called quartering. But this wasn't the quick version you might have heard about in other historical contexts. The Drevlians tied Igor between two young trees that had been bent down to the ground. When they released the trees to spring back to their natural positions, Igor's body was literally torn in half, with each piece catapulted in opposite directions. Now, I want you to understand something crucial about this execution method. This wasn't something they did in the heat of anger. This was a calculated ceremonial killing that required preparation, planning, and deliberate choice. The Drevlians had to find the right trees, bend them down, tie Igor in position, and then make a conscious decision to release him to his death. Every step was intentional. More importantly, this was a form of execution the Drevlians reserved for enemies they considered especially despicable. It wasn't just murder, it was a public statement about what they thought of Kiev's authority and Igor's right to rule over them. They were saying, in the most brutal terms possible, that they would rather face whatever consequences Kiev might send than continue submitting to what they saw as intolerable humiliation. When news of Igor's death reached Kiev at the end of 945 AD, it created a crisis that threatened to destroy everything he and Olga had built together. Remember, their son Sviatoslav was only 3 years old, far too young to rule during a period of political chaos. Vassal tribes throughout their territory began questioning their loyalty to Kiev, seeing Igor's humiliating death as evidence that the dynasty was weak and vulnerable. External enemies, especially the Byzantine Empire, immediately began preparing to exploit what they saw as an opportunity to expand their influence in the region. Kiev's trading partners started hedging their bets, unsure whether the kingdom would survive its leader's death. Everything Igor and Olga had spent 25 years building was suddenly hanging by a thread. It was in this moment of existential crisis that Olga made a decision that would define not only the rest of her life, but the entire future of Russian history. Instead of accepting the traditional role of a widow, stepping aside while male nobles assumed power, she declared herself Grand Princess Regent and took direct control of the government. This was absolutely unprecedented. We're talking about a society where women rarely inherited property, let alone political power. But Olga had spent 25 years as Igor's partner in rule, not just his wife. She knew the government, she knew the military, she knew the diplomatic relationships, and she knew exactly who could be trusted and who couldn't. Most importantly, she had something that the male nobles who might have challenged her lacked. She had a plan, not just for maintaining power, but for dealing with the Drevlians who had murdered her husband. And that plan was about to reveal capabilities for strategic thinking and calculated cruelty that would make her one of the most feared rulers in medieval history. But here's what I want you to understand about Olga's mental state at this moment. This wasn't just about political power or even about justice in any conventional sense. This was personal. The woman who had spent over 2 decades building a life and kingdom with the man she loved was now staring at the reality that he had been torn apart by people who then had the audacity to think they could get away with it. The Olga who emerged from this crisis was fundamentally different from the diplomatic, administratively competent princess who had helped Igor rule. That woman was gone, replaced by someone whose intelligence was now focused entirely on one goal: making the Drevlians suffer in ways that would be remembered for centuries. And here's the most chilling part. She was about to demonstrate that when it comes to creative revenge, a brilliant woman with unlimited power and nothing left to lose can surpass any man in calculated cruelty. Here's where Olga's story transforms from medieval politics into something that reads like a psychological thriller. Because what happened next wasn't just revenge. It was a masterclass in manipulation that reveals the kind of mind we're dealing with. Remember, at this point, the Drevlians think they've won. They've killed the Grand Prince of Kiev, they've demonstrated their military power, and they're probably expecting either immediate retaliation or attempts at negotiation. What they're not expecting is what actually happens next, because Olga is about to demonstrate that she thinks several moves ahead of everyone else in this deadly game. It's early 946 AD when the Drevlians make their first fatal mistake. Encouraged by their victory over Igor and completely misreading the political situation in Kiev, they send an embassy to Olga with a proposal that reveals just how arrogant and tone-deaf they've become. They want her to marry Mal, the Drevlian prince who ordered Igor's execution. Let me pause here and let that sink in. These people murdered her husband in the most humiliating way possible, and now they're proposing that she should reward this murder by marrying the man responsible. From their perspective, it probably seemed logical. It would unite both territories under Drevlian leadership and avoid a costly war. But from Olga's perspective, it was the most insulting proposal imaginable. It was also the opportunity she had been waiting for. Now, here's where Olga's political genius becomes apparent. A lesser ruler might have immediately executed the ambassadors in anger or sent them back with threats of war. But Olga recognizes that these ambassadors represent something much more valuable than targets for immediate revenge. They represent an opportunity to begin destroying the Drevlian leadership systematically, one group at a time. So she does something that must have taken incredible self-control. She receives the ambassadors with courtesy. She listens to their proposal with apparent interest. She tells them she needs time to consult with her advisors and prepare an appropriate response. She hosts them in Kiev with all the honors due to diplomatic representatives, making sure they feel safe and welcome. Picture this scene. Olga, still grieving her husband's brutal death, sitting across from the representatives of his killers, smiling and making polite conversation while her mind is working out the details of their destruction. For several days, she entertains them with banquets and displays of hospitality that convince them their mission is successful. The ambassadors are probably congratulating themselves at this point. They've successfully intimidated Kiev into submission. They've negotiated a marriage alliance that will secure Drevlian dominance, and they're being treated with respect and honor. They have no idea that they're about to become the first victims in a campaign of revenge that will become legendary for its creativity. When Olga finally announces she's ready to give her official response, she organizes an elaborate ceremony. She explains that the Drevlian ambassadors will be received with special honors appropriate to their status as representatives of her future husband. As part of this ceremony, they will be carried in their own boats by Kiev servants to the palace's main hall. A special custom, she explains, reserved for guests of the highest distinction. The ambassadors are flattered by this attention. They're convinced they've won Olga's approval and that their diplomatic mission has been a complete success. They enthusiastically accept this mark of respect, probably already imagining the rewards they'll receive when they return home with news of their victory. What they don't know is that Olga has spent these days of apparent hospitality preparing something that reveals the calculating nature of her mind. She's ordered a deep pit to be dug in the palace courtyard, directly in the path the boats will follow. Not just any pit. We're talking about a hole deep enough to hold 20 men, wide enough that they can't climb out, and positioned so that the carriers can dump the boats and their occupants without warning. When the moment comes, the execution of Olga's plan is flawless. The Kiev servants carry the boats with their honored guests directly to the pit and simply dump them in. The ambassadors, who moments before were congratulating themselves on their diplomatic success, suddenly find themselves trapped in a hole with no way to escape. But here's the detail that reveals the true depths of Olga's transformation. She doesn't just have them killed quickly. She has them buried alive. She stands at the edge of the pit and watches as earth is thrown over 20 living men, their screams gradually muffled as the dirt covers them completely. Think about what this tells us about Olga's mental state. This isn't a moment of passion or sudden anger. This is calculated, premeditated murder, carried out with the kind of attention to detail that suggests she's planned every aspect of their suffering. She wants them to experience the terror of being trapped, the claustrophobia of being buried, the slow horror of suffocating in darkness. More importantly, she wants to watch. This isn't about efficient elimination of enemies. This is about personal satisfaction. The woman who once negotiated diplomatic solutions and sought peaceful resolutions to conflicts is now personally overseeing the slow, terrifying deaths of her enemies. After ensuring all the ambassadors are dead, Olga sends a message to the Drevlians that demonstrates just how sophisticated her long-term planning has become. She informs them that she has accepted the marriage proposal and requests that they send their most noble representatives to escort her with appropriate dignity to Drevlian lands. This message is a masterpiece of deception. She's not just lying about accepting the proposal. She's manipulating the Drevlians into sending her their next group of victims. And the beauty of it is that they have no way of knowing what happened to their first embassy. As far as they know, their representatives successfully negotiated the marriage alliance and are probably being honored as heroes. The Drevlians receive this message and see it as confirmation of their diplomatic triumph. Not only has Kiev's princess agreed to marry their leader, but she's requesting an honor guard of their most important nobles to escort her to the wedding. It seems like the perfect conclusion to their campaign against Igor. They've eliminated their enemy, and now they're going to absorb his kingdom through marriage. So they prepare their second embassy, and this is where their arrogance becomes their fatal weakness. Instead of sending another group of ordinary ambassadors, they decide this mission deserves their absolute best. They gather military chiefs, our priests, and members of their most powerful families. Essentially, they're putting the entire Drevlian leadership into a single diplomatic mission. From their perspective, this makes perfect sense. This is a moment of triumph that deserves to be marked by the participation of their society's most distinguished members. From Olga's perspective, it's like Christmas morning. Her enemies are voluntarily gathering their most valuable people and sending them directly into her hands. As the second Drevlian embassy prepares to depart for Kiev, they're probably imagining the honors they'll receive, the wealth they'll gain from the new alliance, and the power they'll wield once Kiev is absorbed into Drevlian territory. They have no idea they're walking into a trap that will demonstrate that their first embassy's fate was just the beginning of Olga's campaign. And here's what makes this so psychologically chilling. Olga is already planning their deaths while maintaining the facade of an eager bride-to-be. She's writing welcoming messages while preparing their execution. She's expressing gratitude for their kindness while calculating exactly how she wants them to die. The woman who was once known for her diplomatic skill and administrative competence has become something far more dangerous. A master manipulator who can smile at her enemies while orchestrating their destruction in elaborate detail. When the second Drevlian embassy arrives in Kiev, they're riding high on what they believe is their greatest diplomatic triumph. These aren't just random ambassadors. We're talking about the cream of Drevlian society. Military commanders who've won battles, priests who guide their spiritual life, and nobles from the most powerful families. Essentially, this is the Drevlian elite, all gathered in one place because they believe they're about to witness the final submission of Kiev to their authority. Olga receives them with even more elaborate hospitality than she showed the first group. And here's where her psychological manipulation becomes truly sophisticated. She doesn't just treat them well, she treats them like family. She explains that as representatives of her future husband, they deserve the highest honors Kiev can offer. She personally ensures they're comfortable, well-fed, and treated with the respect due to distinguished guests. But there's something different about her demeanor this time. The first group of ambassadors were received with political courtesy, formal, appropriate, but somewhat distant. This second group is welcomed with what appears to be genuine warmth. Olga seems excited about the prospect of marriage, grateful for their kindness in arranging the alliance, and eager to discuss the details of her new life among the Drevlians. It's a performance that would be impressive in any era, but in medieval times, when most people wore their emotions plainly, Olga's ability to project false feelings while planning mass murder demonstrates a level of self-control that's frankly terrifying. For several days, she entertains these 50 of the most important Drevlians with banquets, entertainment, and conversations about their future alliance. She asks detailed questions about Drevlian customs, expresses interest in their religious practices, and seems genuinely excited about learning their ways of life. The Drevlian nobles are charmed. Here's a princess who not only accepts their victory over her husband, but seems eager to embrace their culture and way of life. They're probably thinking they've hit the political jackpot. Not only have they eliminated their enemy and avoided a costly war, but they've gained a cooperative princess who will make the transition to Drevlian rule smooth and profitable. They're so convinced of their success that they begin discussing among themselves how to divide up Kiev's territories and wealth once the marriage is complete. This is when Olga introduces the element that will seal their fate. She explains that before she can properly prepare for the wedding, she needs to purify herself according to proper customs. But more importantly, as the future wife of their prince, it's appropriate for them to undergo ritual purification as well. They need to cleanse themselves from the journey and prepare appropriately for their ceremonial responsibilities. In medieval times, ritual bathing before important ceremonies was common practice, especially for nobles and religious occasions. The Drevlian representatives find nothing suspicious about this request. In fact, they probably see it as evidence of Olga's respect for proper protocol and her serious commitment to the marriage alliance. Olga has a special bathhouse prepared for her distinguished guests. It's described in the chronicles as being larger than usual, built specifically to accommodate the entire delegation comfortably. She explains that she's had it constructed to honor their status. Only the finest accommodations for the representatives of her future husband. The bathhouse is positioned slightly away from the main palace complex, which Olga explains is for privacy and ceremonial purposes. The Drevlian nobles appreciate this attention to detail. They see it as further evidence that Kiev's princess is not only accepting her new role, but embracing it with enthusiasm and proper respect for their customs. What they don't realize is that Olga has spent these days of apparent hospitality planning every detail of what's about to happen. The bathhouse isn't just larger than usual. It's been specifically designed as a death trap. The doors are reinforced, so they can't be broken down from the inside. The windows are positioned too high for escape. The entire structure has been built with one purpose: to serve as a giant oven for burning her enemies alive. On the appointed day, all 50 members of the Drevlian elite enter the bathhouse together. They're probably relaxed, maybe even jovial, discussing the successful completion of their mission and looking forward to the ceremonial responsibilities ahead. Some might be joking about the unusual luxury of having an entire bathhouse to themselves, or commenting on Kiev's impressive hospitality. As soon as the last Drevlian enters the building, Olga gives the signal she's been waiting days to give. The doors are immediately locked and sealed from the outside. Not just closed, but barricaded so that no amount of force from inside can open them. Within moments, the Drevlian nobles realize they've been trapped, but by then, it's already too late to do anything about it. Then Olga's servants set fire to the entire structure. Now, I want you to imagine this scene from multiple perspectives, because understanding the full horror of what happens next is crucial to understanding the depths of Olga's transformation. From inside the bathhouse, 50 of the most powerful Drevlians are suddenly trapped in a building that's rapidly filling with smoke and flames. These are warriors who faced death in battle, nobles who've commanded men in desperate situations, but they've never experienced anything like this. They're not dying from sword wounds or arrow strikes. They're being slowly cooked alive in a building specifically designed to maximize their suffering. From outside, Olga is watching the entire spectacle. According to witnesses, the screams could be heard throughout Kiev as the flames consumed both the building and its occupants. The fire burns hot enough and long enough to ensure that no one inside survives, but slowly enough that their deaths are prolonged and agonizing. But here's what reveals the true psychological impact of what Olga has done. She doesn't just watch from a distance. She positions herself where she can hear every scream, see every desperate attempt at escape, witness every moment of their realization that they're going to die horribly. This isn't just about eliminating enemies. This is about personal satisfaction derived from their suffering. Think about the planning that went into this execution. Olga had to design the bathhouse, coordinate with builders who understood its true purpose, position servants who could lock the doors at exactly the right moment, and prepare the incendiary materials needed to ensure the fire would burn hot enough to kill everyone inside. Every detail was calculated to maximize both the certainty of death and the duration of suffering. More importantly, she had to maintain her deception throughout the entire process. While planning this elaborate death trap, she was simultaneously hosting banquets, making conversation, and projecting the image of a grateful princess excited about her new life. The level of self-control required to pull this off suggests someone who has moved far beyond normal human emotional responses. When the bathhouse finally stops burning and the screams finally stop, Olga has eliminated 70 of the most important Drevlians through 2 carefully planned operations. But according to the historical sources, she shows no signs of satisfaction or completion. If anything, she seems energized by her success and ready to escalate her campaign of revenge to even more elaborate levels. The woman who once negotiated peaceful solutions to political conflicts has become someone who derives pleasure from watching her enemies burn alive. And the most terrifying part? She's just getting started. At this point, you might be thinking that Olga has accomplished her revenge. She's eliminated 70 of the most important Drevlians through 2 brilliantly executed traps. But here's what you need to understand about the mindset we're dealing with. Olga isn't interested in proportional justice or sending a message that will deter future attacks. She's operating on a completely different level of strategic thinking, and her appetite for revenge has only grown with each successful operation. The Drevlians, meanwhile, are facing a crisis they don't even fully understand yet. They sent their first embassy to negotiate a marriage alliance, and those ambassadors never returned. They sent their second embassy, their most important nobles, to escort their future princess, and they haven't heard from them either. At some point, tribal leaders start wondering what's happening in Kiev, but they're not yet thinking in terms of systematic deception and mass murder. This is when Olga demonstrates her understanding of psychology and politics at a level that's frankly breathtaking. Instead of allowing the Drevlians to become suspicious, she takes the initiative and sends them a third message that's so perfectly calculated, it reveals the mind of a master manipulator. She informs the Drevlians that she will arrive soon for the wedding ceremony, but first, she desires to perform appropriate funeral rituals at Igor's tomb. She explains that she needs to ensure her husband's soul approves of her new union, that she can't move forward with marriage until she's properly honored the dead and received spiritual permission to begin a new chapter of her life. This message is psychologically brilliant on multiple levels. First, it explains why they haven't heard from their embassies. Obviously, their representatives are busy preparing for the princess's arrival and the elaborate ceremonies that will surround the wedding. Second, it demonstrates Olga's respect for proper religious customs and her serious commitment to doing things correctly. Third, it positions her as a grieving widow who is struggling with the emotional complexity of remarriage, but ultimately willing to move forward for political reasons. From the Drevlian perspective, this message is exactly what they want to hear. It shows that Kiev's princess is not only accepting their victory, but approaching it with the kind of thoughtful, respectful attitude that will make the political transition smooth. They're probably impressed by her wisdom in wanting to honor Igor properly before moving on, and they see this as evidence that she'll be a cooperative partner in their future alliance. So they enthusiastically agree to her proposal and begin organizing what they intend to be the most elaborate funeral feast in their tribal history. This isn't just going to be a small ceremony. They're planning a celebration that will include thousands of participants from all Drevlian settlements. It's going to be a demonstration of tribal unity, a show of respect for their future princess's dead husband, and a celebration of their political triumph, all rolled into one massive event. Think about what this means from Olga's perspective. The Drevlians are voluntarily gathering their entire population in one location, away from their fortified settlements, in a celebratory mood where they'll be relaxed and unprepared for military action. It's like they're designing their own destruction and sending her an invitation to oversee it personally. When the day arrives for this funeral banquet, Olga's performance reaches levels that would be impressive for a professional actress. She arrives with only a small escort, maintaining the appearance of a vulnerable widow who's dependent on Drevlian protection for her safety. She participates in the funeral rituals with appropriate solemnity, shedding convincing tears over Igor's tomb and expressing touching gratitude for Drevlian kindness in allowing her to pay final respects before moving forward with her new life. During the preliminary ceremonies, she speaks about Igor in terms that portray their relationship as deeply loving, but also acknowledge that death is part of life and that the living must continue. She talks about her hopes for the future, her gratitude for the Drevlian people's acceptance, and her excitement about learning their customs and becoming part of their community. The Drevlians are completely convinced. Here's a princess who not only accepts their victory over her husband, but seems genuinely eager to embrace their way of life. Even tribal members who had initially been skeptical about the marriage alliance are won over by her apparent sincerity and gracious acceptance of the political reality. As evening approaches and the actual banquet begins, Olga's performance shifts into what can only be described as a masterpiece of deception. She drinks mead with tribal chiefs, sharing toasts to their future alliance and expressing hopes for prosperity and peace. She listens to their stories about Drevlian history and culture with apparent fascination, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrate her interest in becoming part of their community. She even participates in discussions about Igor's death, acknowledging that political conflicts sometimes lead to violence while expressing her belief that his death can ultimately serve a greater purpose by bringing their peoples together in marriage alliance. The Drevlians are amazed by her wisdom and maturity. Here's a woman who can look beyond personal grief to see larger political possibilities. As the night progresses and alcohol flows freely, the atmosphere becomes increasingly celebratory. Thousands of Drevlians are participating in what they believe is both a funeral feast and a pre-wedding celebration. They're toasting their military victory, their successful diplomacy, and their bright political future. Many are probably already planning how they'll benefit from the wealth and territory they're about to acquire through marriage alliance. The tribal chiefs are particularly pleased with themselves. They've eliminated their most dangerous enemy, avoided a costly war, and negotiated a marriage that will give them control over Kiev's resources and strategic position. From their perspective, they've achieved the perfect military and diplomatic victory. This is when Olga gives the signal she's been waiting all evening to give. Kiev warriors who have been hidden in the surrounding forests emerge simultaneously from multiple directions, completely encircling the banquet site. Before the intoxicated Drevlians can react adequately to this sudden appearance of armed men, they realize they're trapped in a killing field with no possibility of escape. What follows is described in the chronicles as a massacre that lasted throughout the night. 5,000 Drevlians, essentially the entire adult male population of their tribe, are slaughtered in organized killing that demonstrates careful military planning and coordination. But here's what makes this massacre particularly significant. It's not just random violence or battlefield carnage. This is systematic elimination carried out with the kind of efficiency that suggests Olga has planned every detail of the operation. Her warriors know exactly where to position themselves, how to prevent escape attempts, and how to ensure that no one survives to carry news of what happened back to Drevlian settlements. Think about the logistics involved in this operation. Olga had to coordinate the movement of sufficient military forces to surround and eliminate 5,000 people. She had to ensure these forces could remain hidden until the moment of attack. She had to time the operation so that the Drevlians would be maximally vulnerable, relaxed, intoxicated, and far from their defensive positions. More importantly, she had to maintain her deception throughout the entire evening, even while knowing that everyone around her was about to die horribly. She's making toasts and sharing stories while mentally counting down the minutes until she gives the signal for mass slaughter. The level of psychological control required for this performance is almost superhuman. When dawn breaks over the massacre site, Olga has eliminated essentially the entire Drevlian leadership and military force through 3 coordinated operations. Any normal ruler might consider this sufficient revenge for her husband's death. But Olga is operating according to a completely different logic. She's not just seeking revenge for Igor's murder. She's pursuing the complete elimination of the Drevlian people as a political and cultural entity. The massacre at the funeral feast wasn't the conclusion of her campaign. It was preparation for the final phase of what can only be described as systematic genocide. And the most chilling aspect of her transformation is that she seems to derive genuine satisfaction from watching her plans unfold. This isn't someone who kills out of necessity or even anger. This is someone who has discovered that she enjoys the process of elaborate revenge and is already planning even more creative forms of destruction. After the massacre at the funeral feast, you might think Olga's thirst for revenge would finally be satisfied. She's eliminated thousands of Drevlians, including virtually their entire leadership. She's demonstrated her power in the most brutal terms possible. But here's what makes Olga's story so psychologically fascinating and historically significant. The massacre wasn't the end of her campaign. It was preparation for something far more systematic and complete. What Olga had accomplished through her 3 elaborate traps was the elimination of Drevlian military and political leadership. But the Drevlian people themselves, their families, their culture, their very existence as an identifiable tribe, remained intact in their fortified settlements. From Olga's perspective, this was unfinished business that required a final solution. In the year 946 AD, she returned to Drevlian lands, but this time she came openly as a conqueror with a formal army of 10,000 men. This wasn't going to be another elaborate deception or clever trap. This was going to be a war of extermination designed to eliminate the Drevlians as an identifiable people and serve as a warning to any other tribe that might consider challenging Kiev's authority. The target of this final campaign was Iskorostan, the main Drevlian city and the place where Igor had been captured and executed. This wasn't just strategically important, it was symbolically crucial. Iskorostan was where Olga's husband had died, where the decision to torture him had been made, and where the Drevlian leadership had celebrated their victory over Kiev. In Olga's mind, destroying this city completely was necessary to truly honor Igor's memory and complete her revenge. But when Olga's army arrived at Iskorostan, she discovered that conquest wouldn't be as simple as she had hoped. The Drevlians had used the months since the funeral feast massacre to prepare their main city for siege. They'd reinforced the walls, stockpiled food and water, and gathered the remaining population from outlying settlements into the fortified center. More importantly, the survivors of Olga's previous operations had finally realized what they were dealing with. This wasn't just another political conflict that could be resolved through negotiation or tribute. This was a ruler who intended to eliminate them completely, and their only hope of survival was to make conquest so costly that even Olga would eventually agree to terms. What followed was a siege that lasted almost a full year and became legendary throughout Eastern Europe for Olga's relentless persistence. She rejected every surrender offer, refused to negotiate tributes or hostages, and made clear that her only demand was the complete destruction of the city and extermination of its inhabitants. Think about what this means in practical terms. Maintaining a siege for almost a year requires enormous resources, complex logistics, and absolute commitment to the goal. Olga had to keep 10,000 men supplied with food, weapons, and equipment while ensuring they remained motivated despite months of potentially boring siege warfare. She had to prevent relief expeditions from reaching the city while maintaining her own supply lines. Most importantly, she had to resist the natural human tendency to accept a reasonable compromise when the siege dragged on far longer than anyone expected. The fact that she sustained this siege for nearly a year, rejecting multiple opportunities to claim victory through surrender, reveals something crucial about her psychological state. This isn't just about political or military objectives anymore. This is about a personal obsession that has consumed her entire identity. During the siege, the Drevlians tried every possible strategy to save themselves. They offered massive tribute payments that would have made Kiev wealthy for generations. They proposed hostages from their most important families. They even offered to relocate their entire population to distant territories where they would never threaten Kiev again. Olga rejected every proposal without negotiation. Her response to all surrender offers was the same: complete destruction of the city and elimination of its population. She wasn't interested in wealth, hostages, or political solutions. She wanted extinction. As the siege dragged on and conditions inside Iskorostan became increasingly desperate, the psychological pressure on both sides must have been enormous. The Drevlians were facing starvation, disease, and the constant fear that their walls would eventually be breached. Olga's soldiers were dealing with the frustration and boredom of siege warfare while maintaining readiness for final assault. But Olga herself seems to have thrived during this period. Contemporary accounts describe her as energetic, focused, and completely committed to seeing the siege through to its conclusion. While her soldiers grew tired and her advisors suggested accepting reasonable surrender terms, Olga remained fixated on total victory. This is when the Drevlians made their final desperate attempt to save themselves. Facing growing famine and with no hope of external relief, they sent messengers with a proposal that revealed how completely they had misunderstood the woman they were dealing with. They offered to pay tribute in the form of honey and furs, traditional payments that would demonstrate their submission while preserving their lives and their city. When Olga rejected this offer, they became even more desperate and asked what tribute she would accept. Olga's response has become legendary in the history of psychological warfare. She said she would accept the city's surrender if each house provided 3 doves and 3 sparrows as symbolic tribute. It was such a modest demand, especially compared to the massive payments they had already offered, that the Drevlians immediately accepted, believing they had finally found a way to appease their tormentor. What they didn't realize was that they had just provided Olga with the means for their own destruction in a way that demonstrates the truly diabolical nature of her intelligence. When the birds were delivered, Olga ordered small pieces of incendiary material to be tied to their feet, sulfur-soaked cloth that would burn slowly but intensely. The birds were then simultaneously released to return to their nests in Drevlian houses throughout the city. Think about the psychological impact of this moment. The Drevlians probably felt relief as they watched their birds flying home, believing they had finally satisfied Olga's demands and saved their city. But within hours, Every building in Iskorostan was ablaze as thousands of small fires spread through the wooden structures. The beauty of this strategy, if you can call calculated genocide beautiful, was that it was almost impossible to fight. Traditional siege warfare involved breaching walls and fighting through streets, giving defenders opportunities to resist. But Olga had turned the city's own animal population into a delivery system for destruction. Every house, every building, every possible hiding place was simultaneously set on fire from within. The chronicles describe what happened next as complete chaos. Inhabitants who tried to flee the burning buildings were met by Olga's soldiers, who had orders to kill anyone attempting to escape. Those who remained in their homes hoping to fight the fires were burned alive as the flames spread faster than they could be controlled. The destruction was so complete that Iskorostan was never rebuilt. Modern archaeologists have identified the site through a layer of ash that covers several square kilometers, physical evidence of one of the first documented genocides in European history. It's estimated that 10,000 people died in the final conflagration, making Olga's campaign against the Drevlians one of the most successful elimination operations in medieval warfare. But here's what makes this conclusion to Olga's revenge campaign so psychologically significant. She didn't just destroy Iskorostan and kill its inhabitants. She destroyed the very possibility of Drevlian cultural continuity. Their main city was gone, their leadership was gone, their military was gone, and their population was scattered or dead. The Drevlians, as an identifiable people, ceased to exist. When Olga finally considered her revenge complete, she had accomplished something that goes beyond normal medieval warfare. She had used a combination of psychological manipulation, strategic deception, and systematic violence to eliminate an entire culture from the historical record. The Drevlians had murdered her husband, and she had responded by erasing them from existence. The woman who had once been known for diplomatic skill and administrative competence had become something unprecedented in medieval history. A ruler who could combine brilliant strategic thinking with unlimited capacity for violence to achieve objectives that went far beyond normal political goals. And perhaps most remarkably, she seemed to have enjoyed every moment of it. Here's where Olga's story takes a turn that might seem impossible to believe if it weren't so thoroughly documented in historical sources. After spending years orchestrating some of the most calculated acts of mass murder in medieval history, Olga underwent a transformation that was, in its own way, as dramatic as her transformation from grieving widow to vengeful killer. For the next 15 years after the elimination of the Drevlians, Olga ruled Kiev with the same iron determination she had shown in her revenge campaign. But instead of directing that determination toward creative forms of violence, she channeled it into building one of the most effective autocratic systems in Eastern European history. Let me paint you a picture of what Kiev looked like under Olga's rule during this period, because understanding her domestic policies is crucial to understanding how someone capable of genocide could also be an effective ruler. First, she developed a spy network that extended throughout her territory and beyond. We're talking about an intelligence system that could monitor potential rebellions, track the movements of foreign armies, and gather information about political developments in neighboring kingdoms. This wasn't just paranoia. This was systematic information gathering that allowed her to anticipate problems before they became threats. Second, she established legal codes that were brutal in their clarity. Disloyalty to Kiev wasn't just punished, it was punished in ways designed to serve as examples to anyone else who might be considering rebellion. Public executions became regular political theater, with methods of death specifically chosen to maximize psychological impact on witnesses. Third, she used her reputation for creative cruelty as a diplomatic tool. Other rulers throughout Eastern Europe knew exactly what had happened to the Drevlians, and they understood that challenging Kiev might result in consequences that went far beyond normal military defeat. Olga's reputation for unlimited revenge became a form of deterrence that prevented conflicts before they started. But here's what makes this period so psychologically fascinating. Olga seems to have been genuinely effective as a ruler, not just feared. Her tax systems were efficient without being crushing. Her trade policies encouraged economic growth. Her military reforms created armed forces that were both powerful and loyal. People living under her rule generally prospered as long as they remained absolutely loyal to her authority. It's like she had channeled all the intelligence and strategic thinking she'd used for revenge into the more conventional challenges of medieval statecraft. The same mind that could orchestrate elaborate deceptions to eliminate enemies could also design legal systems, economic policies, and military structures that actually worked. Then, in 955 AD, something happened that changed not only Olga's personal life, but the entire future direction of Russian civilization. She decided to convert to Christianity, and she didn't just convert privately. She traveled to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, to be baptized personally by the emperor. Now let me explain why this decision was so historically significant, because it goes far beyond personal religious choice. Kiev at this time was pagan, worshipping Slavic gods through rituals that often included human sacrifice. Converting to Christianity wasn't just changing personal beliefs. It was aligning Kiev with the Byzantine Christian world and establishing the foundations for what would eventually become Russian Orthodox Christianity. But from a psychological perspective, Olga's conversion raises questions that historians are still debating. How does someone who derived satisfaction from watching thousands of people burn alive suddenly embrace a religion based on forgiveness, mercy, and love for one's enemies? There are several possible explanations, and I think understanding them reveals important aspects of Olga's complex personality. First, it's possible that her conversion was primarily political. Aligning with Byzantine Christianity would give Kiev access to more sophisticated diplomatic, economic, and military systems. It would position Kiev as part of the Christian world, rather than as a pagan kingdom on the periphery of civilization. From this perspective, Olga's conversion was another brilliant, strategic decision designed to strengthen her kingdom's position. Second, it's possible that her conversion represented genuine spiritual transformation. Maybe the woman who had spent years consumed by revenge finally reached a point where she recognized the psychological and spiritual costs of unlimited hatred. Maybe Christianity offered her a framework for moving beyond the cycles of violence that had defined her reign. Third, and perhaps most intriguingly, it's possible that Olga saw Christianity as compatible with her approach to power. Christian rulers throughout medieval Europe routinely used extreme violence to maintain authority while justifying their actions as service to God. Maybe Olga recognized that Christian kingship could provide religious justification for the same autocratic methods she had already perfected. Whatever her motivations for conversion, the historical impact was enormous. Olga's embrace of Christianity established precedents that her grandson Vladimir would later follow when he officially Christianized the entire kingdom. In effect, Olga's personal religious decision became the foundation for Russian Orthodox Christianity, one of the most significant cultural and political forces in world history. But here's the most remarkable aspect of Olga's post-conversion period. Despite her documented history of systematic mass murder, she was eventually canonized as a saint by the Orthodox Church. Think about that for a moment. The same woman who buried ambassadors alive, burned nobles in bathhouses, and organized the genocide of an entire people is officially recognized as Saint Olga, equal to the apostles. This canonization reveals something important about medieval Christian attitudes toward violence and political power. The Church wasn't judging Olga by modern standards of human rights or proportional justice. They were evaluating her according to medieval criteria that emphasized her role in bringing Christianity to Russia and her effectiveness as a defender of Christian political order. From the Church's perspective, Olga's violence against pagans could be interpreted as service to God. while her conversion and promotion of Christianity made her a crucial figure in the expansion of Christian civilization. The brutality that modern people find appalling was seen by medieval Christians as evidence of her commitment to eliminating enemies of the faith. This creates one of the most striking ironies in medieval history. The woman who committed some of the most calculated atrocities became one of Russia's first Christian rulers and is still venerated as a saint today. It's a contradiction that reveals the vast differences between medieval and modern moral frameworks. When Olga died in 969 AD, after 24 years of rule, she had fundamentally transformed not only Kiev, but the entire trajectory of Eastern European civilization. She had demonstrated that exceptional circumstances could reveal capacities for both political brilliance and systematic cruelty that challenged conventional assumptions about medieval women's roles and capabilities. Her legacy remains profoundly contradictory. On one hand, she was one of the most effective rulers in early Slavic history, someone who established legal, military, and economic systems that served as foundations for later Russian development. On the other hand, her methods of achieving and maintaining power included some of the most creative acts of mass murder in medieval European history. But perhaps the most important aspect of Olga's legacy is what her story reveals about the relationship between intelligence, power, and moral choice. Here was someone with exceptional capabilities for strategic thinking and political leadership, who chose to use those capabilities in ways that eliminated thousands of people while simultaneously building institutions that benefited thousands of others. She remains a figure who defies simple moral categories, someone whose story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of political power and the potential for both greatness and monstrosity that exists within exceptional individuals. So here we are at the end of one of the most complex and disturbing stories in medieval history. We've followed Olga of Kiev from her origins as a village girl through her transformation into a devoted wife, then into one of history's most creative killers, and finally, into a Christian saint whose legacy still influences Russian culture today. Let me ask you this: what do you make of a woman who could orchestrate the systematic elimination of thousands of people while simultaneously building legal and economic systems that improved the lives of thousands of others? How do we evaluate someone who combined brilliant political intelligence with unlimited capacity for revenge? These aren't just historical questions. They're fundamental questions about human nature that remain relevant today. Olga's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that exceptional intelligence and political skill don't necessarily correlate with what we might consider moral behavior. In fact, her story suggests that the same capabilities that make someone an effective leader can also make them extraordinarily dangerous when those capabilities are directed toward destruction. Think about the psychological transformation we've witnessed. Olga began as someone known for diplomatic skill and administrative competence. But when her husband was murdered and she faced the choice between accepting a passive role or seizing power for herself, she chose power. And she chose to exercise that power in ways that prioritized complete revenge over proportional justice. What's most striking about her methods is their creativity and sophistication. Olga didn't just kill her enemies. She manipulated them into situations where they became collaborators in their own destruction. The Drevlian ambassadors walked willingly into pits where they would be buried alive. The Drevlian nobles eagerly entered bathhouses that became their crematoriums. The entire Drevlian population gathered voluntarily for a funeral feast that became their mass execution. This suggests someone who understood psychology, politics, and human nature at levels that allowed her to predict and control her enemies' behavior with almost supernatural accuracy. She could think multiple moves ahead, anticipate reactions, and design elaborate scenarios that achieved her objectives while maintaining the appearance of cooperation or even friendship. But here's what I find most psychologically fascinating about Olga's story. She seems to have genuinely enjoyed the process of elaborate revenge. This wasn't someone who killed out of necessity or political calculation. This was someone who derived satisfaction from watching her plans unfold and her enemies suffer in ways specifically designed to maximize their horror and humiliation. Yet the same woman who burned thousands of people alive also demonstrated genuine skill at the conventional challenges of medieval rule. Her legal codes, tax systems, and military reforms were effective and beneficial for her subjects. Her diplomatic initiatives strengthened Kiev's position and expanded its influence. Her conversion to Christianity established foundations for cultural and religious developments that influenced centuries of Russian history. This contradiction challenges our normal assumptions about the relationship between personal morality and political effectiveness. We'd like to believe that good rulers are good people, and that cruel rulers are incompetent tyrants. But Olga's story suggests that the reality is far more complex and morally ambiguous. Perhaps most remarkably, her transformation from pagan killer to Christian saint reveals something important about medieval attitudes toward violence and political power that differs dramatically from modern perspectives. The same actions that we would consider disqualifying for sainthood were seen by medieval Christians as evidence of her commitment to eliminating enemies of the faith. This raises questions that extend far beyond medieval history. How do we evaluate historical figures whose actions don't fit neatly into our moral categories? How do we balance recognition of political achievement against revulsion at the methods used to achieve those accomplishments? And what does Olga's story tell us about the potential for both greatness and monstrosity that exists within exceptional individuals? I think Olga's legacy forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that human beings are capable of far more moral complexity than we typically acknowledge. She wasn't a simple villain or a straightforward hero. She was someone whose exceptional capabilities were directed toward objectives that produced both remarkable achievements and horrifying atrocities. Her story also reveals something important about the relationship between personal trauma and political behavior. The woman who orchestrated systematic genocide was also someone who had experienced profound personal loss and betrayal. This doesn't excuse her actions, but it helps explain how someone capable of effective rule could also be capable of unlimited revenge. Perhaps most importantly, Olga's story demonstrates the crucial importance of institutional constraints on political power. When someone with her intelligence and determination operates without meaningful limitations on their authority, the results can be both impressive and terrifying. Her effectiveness as a ruler and her capacity for creative violence both stemmed from the same source: absolute power combined with exceptional intelligence. In our modern world, where we continue to grapple with questions about the relationship between effective leadership and moral behavior, Olga's story remains remarkably relevant. She represents both the potential benefits and the inherent dangers of concentrating power in the hands of exceptionally capable individuals. So what do you think? Does Olga's effectiveness as a ruler balance against her methods of achieving and maintaining power? Can someone who commits systematic atrocities still be considered a successful political leader? And what does her eventual canonization tell us about the relationship between religious authority and political violence? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they're questions worth thinking about as we try to understand both medieval history and the continuing challenges of political leadership in any era. If you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the complex and often shocking stories that shaped our world. And let me know in the comments, what aspect of Olga's story surprised you the most? How do you think we should evaluate historical figures whose legacies include both remarkable achievements and horrifying atrocities? Next week, we'll be exploring another figure whose story challenges our assumptions about medieval morality and political power. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, And remember that the truth about history is often far more complex and disturbing than the simplified versions we learned in school.